It was a bright morning in the city, the kind that made glass towers sparkle and coffee carts line up on every corner. People hurried across the streets, phones in hand, faces half hidden behind sunglasses. Among the noise of cars and chatter, a quiet melody floated through the air, soft, yet powerful enough to make a few strangers pause. Near the corner of the park, a young woman sat on a small wooden stool with an old violin resting on her shoulder. Her fingers danced with care across the strings, her bow moving like it was telling a story words couldn't express. She wasn't playing for fame or money. She was playing for peace. Her clothes were simple, her hair tied back neatly, and beside her a small open case lay with a few coins inside. Some people stopped to listen for a while, then moved on. Some just glanced, uninterested. But the woman kept playing, eyes half closed, lost in her own rhythm. The melody was something she had written herself, a tune about memories, loss, and hope. She called it The Promise. Across the street, a black car slowed down. The car's paint was spotless, reflecting the morning light like a mirror. Inside sat a man in a gray suit, tall, handsome, and clearly used to the world bending in his favor. His name was Ethan Vale, one of the country's youngest billionaires. Ethan had built his fortune in technology, creating apps that changed how people shopped, worked, and even dated. To the world, he was brilliant, confident, and powerful. To those who worked under him, he was known for being sharp, impatient, and brutally honest. He had little time for anything that didn't make money. His driver, a middle-aged man who'd been with him for years, noticed Ethan looking out the window. "Do you want me to stop, sir?" Ethan frowned slightly. "What's that sound?" "It's a street musician, sir. Happens every morning around this corner," the driver replied. Ethan sighed. "She's blocking the view of my building. Tell security to move her somewhere else." The driver hesitated. "She's not causing trouble, sir. Just playing music." Ethan leaned back, clearly irritated. Music doesn't pay bills. She should find a real job. But something about the melody still lingered in his head. Even as the car moved again, he found himself humming a few notes under his breath. It was annoying. He wasn't supposed to care. That evening, after a long meeting with investors, Ethan walked out of his building. He was tired, frustrated, and a bit on edge. The day hadn't gone as planned. As he reached the lobby, he heard the same melody again. It was softer now, echoing from across the street where the park lights had just turned on. He crossed over, partly out of curiosity, partly to get it over with. The woman was still there, her eyes closed as she played under the street lamp. Her violin had scratches, but the sound it made was rich and warm. A small crowd had gathered. Office workers, children, even an elderly man sitting quietly on a bench. Ethan stood behind them watching. Something about the scene irritated him. People wasting their time listening to someone who probably didn't even have a home. He didn't believe in sentimentality. Then suddenly she stopped playing and looked up. Her eyes met his, calm, brown, and strangely confident. "You've been watching me for a while," she said softly. Ethan blinked. "I wasn't watching. I was just passing by." She smiled faintly. "Then you've been passing by for quite some time." The crowd chuckled quietly. Ethan felt his face heat up. He wasn't used to being talked to that way. Trying to regain control, he smirked. "If you're that good, why are you playing on the street? Don't you have something better to do?" She looked at him for a moment, then said, "Music is my work. It's what I love." Ethan laughed lightly, the sound sharp. "Love doesn't pay rent. Tell you what, if you can play something that truly impresses me, I'll give you something worth more than these coins you're collecting." The woman tilted her head. "And what would that be?" He grinned, half joking, half mocking. "I'll marry you if you play." The crowd gasped and laughed. Ethan enjoyed the reaction. To him it was a harmless joke, a show of confidence. But her face didn't change. She didn't smile or look angry. She just looked at him quietly, almost like she was studying him. "Is that supposed to be an insult or a challenge?" she asked finally. Ethan shrugged. "Whatever makes you pick up that bow faster." Without another word, she placed the violin under her chin again and began to play. The first note was gentle, almost fragile. Then the next grew stronger, deeper. The melody that followed made even the noise of the city fade away. It wasn't just music, it was emotion shaped into sound. Every rise and fall of the bow carried a story, something raw and real. Ethan stood still. The arrogance on his face slowly faded. Around them, people stopped talking. Even car horns sounded distant. The woman's eyes stayed closed as her fingers moved with grace and power, her music painting feelings that words couldn't touch. When she finished, there was silence for a full second before the applause broke out. People cheered, clapped, and even whistled. The woman just smiled humbly and nodded in thanks. Ethan didn't clap. He didn't even move. Something in his chest felt tight. It wasn't embarrassment, it was confusion. For the first time in a long time, he didn't have something clever to say. She looked at him again. So? He opened his mouth, then closed it. Finally, he said, "Who taught you to play like that?" She shrugged. "My father. He used to play in a big orchestra before he got sick. I've been playing ever since I was little." Ethan's tone softened just a bit. "You're wasting your time out here." "I don't think so," she said quietly. "Sometimes people need music more than money." "You wouldn't understand that." The words stung, not because they were rude, but because they felt true. He cleared his throat, trying to recover his usual tone. "Well, you've impressed me. How much do you usually make in a day?" She smiled faintly. "Enough to eat and enough to stay grateful." Ethan reached into his pocket and took out a few bills, more than she probably made in a week. He placed them in the violin case. "Here, consider it a reward." She didn't take the money. "Keep it, I don't play for rewards," he frowned. "You think you're too good for help?" She shook her head. "No, I just don't want to be bought." That answer silenced him again. He wasn't used to people refusing his money nor standing up to him at all. He felt something he hadn't felt in years. Respect. The woman picked up her violin and began packing her things. "Good night, mister." Ethan stood there, watching her walk away, her figure slowly disappearing into the glowing street. The melody still lingered in his head, repeating over and over. That night he couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her, calm, composed, unbothered by his arrogance. For some reason, her words echoed in his mind. Sometimes people need music more than money. The next morning, he arrived at his office early. His assistant greeted him with a nervous smile. "Good morning, sir. You look different today." He ignored the comment and went straight to his desk. But as he looked out the window toward the park, he found himself wondering if she'd be there again. For the next few days, he kept noticing her from a distance. Always at the same spot, always with the same old violin. People stopped to listen, and she always smiled kindly, never asking for anything. One afternoon, he decided to go again, not out of pride this time, but curiosity. He crossed the street quietly, wearing casual clothes instead of his usual suit. She noticed him right away. "Back again?" she asked. He smiled awkwardly. "Maybe I wanted to hear that song again." She nodded and began to play The Promise once more. This time he listened differently. He wasn't trying to analyze or judge. He just listened. When she finished, he asked softly, "Why that song?" "It's the last one my father heard before he passed away," she said. He said it reminded him of what love means, not what you say, but what you do. Ethan's throat felt dry. He didn't know how to respond. The world he lived in was made of deals and numbers, not feelings. But hearing her talk made something shift inside him. As she packed up again, he asked, "What's your name?" She looked at him with a small, knowing smile. "You'll find out if you keep listening." And with that, she walked away again, leaving him standing there, realizing he might have met someone who could change everything he thought he knew. The next few days passed quickly, but Ethan couldn't shake the memory of that evening in the park. Every time he stepped into his car or sat in his office, the melody came back to him. Clear, haunting, and beautiful. It was strange how a few notes could stay inside his mind, more than the applause of investors or the praise of headlines. He tried to bury himself in work, thinking it would help. Meetings, phone calls, and video conferences filled his schedule, but his focus kept slipping. His assistant noticed too. "Sir, you've been staring at that same report for 15 minutes. Ethan blinked and looked down. "Right, send it to finance." The assistant hesitated. "Is something bothering you?" Ethan shook his head quickly. "No, just tired." But it wasn't tiredness. It was curiosity, maybe even guilt. That evening, as the city lights flickered on one by one, Ethan made a sudden decision. "Cancel my dinner plans," he said. "Drive me to the park." When the car stopped by the familiar corner, he rolled down the window. The same soft music floated through the air, and there she was again, the woman with the old violin. She was playing under the same lamp, her posture graceful and calm. A few children sat cross-legged near her, listening quietly. An older woman had her eyes closed, smiling as the song carried through the cool air. Ethan stepped out of the car and walked over. This time there was no crowd watching him. It was quieter, almost peaceful. She noticed him and smiled slightly. "Back again? I told you I can't get that song out of my head," he said, half laughing. "That means it did its job," she replied. "Music should stay with you after it stops." Ethan nodded. "You never told me your name." She looked up at him for a moment, then said softly, "Lena." He repeated it under his breath. "Lena, that's a nice name. Thank you." There was a small pause before he spoke again. "Can I buy you coffee?" She hesitated, clearly surprised. "Coffee? Yes. You've been out here all day. It's the least I can do." Lena studied his face for a few seconds, maybe trying to decide if he was serious. Then she nodded slowly. "All right. But only if I get to pay for mine," he chuckled. "Deal." They walked to a small cafe nearby, one of those quiet places with wooden tables and the smell of roasted beans in the air. Ethan ordered 2 coffees, ignoring her protest about paying. They sat by the window, watching the street outside. "So," he said finally, "why do you play there every day?" Lena stirred her coffee gently. "Because that's where people pass by the most. And sometimes, the people who need music the most are the ones rushing to work." He tilted his head. "You think people need it?" "I know they do," she said softly. "Music reminds people to feel something real. The world's too loud with everything else." He didn't know how to argue with that. She spoke with a quiet confidence that made her words sink in. After a pause, he asked, "Do you live nearby?" "Not far. Just a few streets over. Do you teach music too?" She smiled faintly. "I used to, but not anymore. My father's health got worse and I needed to stay close to home. Playing in the park helps cover what we need." Ethan looked at her carefully. There was no self-pity in her tone, no bitterness. Just honesty. He leaned back. "You could make good money performing in better places. Maybe even online. You've got real talent." She shook her head gently. "I'm not chasing fame. I just want to play for people who listen with their hearts, not their wallets." Her words landed harder than she probably meant them to. Ethan looked down at his cup. "Maybe I've forgotten how to do that," he said quietly. Lena smiled kindly. "Then maybe it's time you remember." They talked for another half hour. Mostly small things, the weather, the noise of the city, her favorite songs. But there was something natural in the way she spoke. No pretenses, no careful words like the people who worked for him. When they finally stood up to leave, Ethan reached for his wallet, but Lena had already placed a few coins on the counter. "Told you I'd pay for mine," she said with a grin. He laughed. "You really don't let anyone do anything for you, do you?" "I don't like owing favors," she said simply. They walked back toward the park together. The night air was cool and the streets had started to quiet down. As they reached the corner, she stopped. "Thank you for the coffee," he nodded. "Thank you for the song." She smiled and started packing up her violin. Ethan turned to leave, but before he got far, he heard her voice behind him. "Hey," she said softly. "You don't always have to talk about money, you know." He turned. "What do you mean?" "Sometimes silence says more." He didn't understand it right away, but later that night, when he was sitting alone in his huge apartment overlooking the city, her words made sense. Silence did say more. It said everything he'd been avoiding. Loneliness, restlessness, emptiness. For years he'd filled his world with noise, meetings, calls, parties, achievements. But for the first time he realized none of it really sounded like life. Over the next few weeks, Ethan found excuses to pass by the park more often. Sometimes he stayed in his car. Sometimes he stood quietly among the small crowd. Lena always seemed to notice him, though she never said much. She just kept playing, eyes closed, letting the music speak for her. One afternoon, it started raining unexpectedly. People scattered, rushing for cover, but Lena didn't stop. She kept playing, water dripping from her hair, her bow moving steadily. Ethan grabbed an umbrella and ran across the street. "You're going to ruin your violin," he shouted. She smiled, still playing. "It's already old. Let it live a little." He laughed and held the umbrella over her anyway. For a moment, time seemed to pause. The city noise faded, and all that existed was the sound of her music and the rain tapping softly on the umbrella. When she finally stopped, he said, You're crazy, she shrugged. Maybe, but I'm happy. He didn't say anything for a long moment. I envy that. She looked up at him curiously. A billionaire envying someone like me? He smiled a little. Money can buy comfort, not peace. Lena's expression softened. Then maybe you should try earning peace instead. That night, Ethan thought about those words again. He began noticing things he hadn't paid attention to in years. The laughter of people in the lobby, the warmth of sunlight through the glass windows, the sound of birds near his balcony. Life had small music everywhere, but he'd been too busy to listen. Days turned into weeks, and their meetings became almost a quiet routine. Sometimes they shared a coffee, sometimes they just talked while she packed up. Lena started telling him more about her life. Her father's love for music, her dream of opening a small community studio for children who couldn't afford lessons, her belief that art wasn't a luxury but a necessity. Ethan, in turn, told her little pieces of his story, how he'd grown up with nothing, how success had made him afraid to lose everything again, how he'd forgotten what it felt like to trust people without contracts or deals. One evening, Lena invited him to visit her home. It's not much, she warned, but my father would love to meet someone who appreciates music. He hesitated. Are you sure? She nodded. You'll be fine. Just don't bring your wallet, he smiled. Deal. Her home was small but warm. Old photos lined the walls, and a faint scent of tea filled the air. Her father sat by the window, thin and pale, but with kind eyes that sparkled when he saw Ethan. So you're the man who challenged my daughter to play for marriage, her father said with a chuckle. Ethan felt his face flush. You heard about that? Oh yes, the old man said. She told me everything. I think it's the funniest proposal I've ever heard. Lena laughed softly from the kitchen. I told you he didn't mean it seriously. Her father smiled. Maybe not then, but life has a funny way of turning jokes into fate. Ethan didn't know what to say. He just smiled politely and sat down. They spent the evening talking, laughing, and listening to Lena play for her father. The room felt alive, full of something money could never buy. Warmth. When Ethan finally left, her father shook his hand. You have a good heart under all that business armor. Don't let it rust, Ethan nodded slowly. I'll try not to. As he stepped out into the night, the air felt different, lighter somehow. He realized he hadn't smiled like that in years. From that day on, Ethan began to change in small but real ways. He started treating his employees differently, listening more, shouting less. He donated instruments to a few local schools under a new foundation, anonymously. He even took weekends off, something he hadn't done in over a decade. But deep down, he knew why everything felt different. It was because of Lena. Her quiet strength, her simple wisdom, her belief that life wasn't measured by wealth but by meaning. One evening, as the sunset painted the sky orange and pink, Ethan stood by the park again. Lena was playing her violin, her face peaceful as ever. When she finished, he walked up slowly. You know, he said, I used to think I had everything. And now? She asked. He smiled gently. Now I think I'm just starting to understand what everything really means. She looked at him for a moment, her eyes warm. Then maybe you're finally listening, he nodded. I am. But what neither of them knew that night was that something big was about to happen. Something that would test both of them in ways they never expected. The following week, the city felt different to Ethan. It wasn't the streets or the buildings that had changed, and it was him. Every time he passed through the park, he found himself slowing down, waiting to hear the soft sound of Lena's violin. The melody had become like a part of his routine, something that reminded him of what peace felt like. But that peace didn't last long. One Monday morning, as Ethan entered his office, he found his assistant waiting nervously by the door. Sir, the media wants a statement. There's been a misunderstanding. Ethan frowned. About what? About you and the street musician, the assistant said carefully. Someone took photos of you with her. The press is saying you're involved with a busker you met on the street. They're making it sound, I don't care what they're saying, Ethan interrupted. It's none of their business. The assistant hesitated. Sir, investors might think, I said I don't care, Ethan repeated, but even as he said it, he could feel anger rising. Not at the rumors, but at how quickly people turned kindness into gossip. By noon, the headlines were everywhere. Billionaire seen with mysterious street violinist, secret romance or charity case. His phone wouldn't stop ringing. Business partners wanted explanations. Friends sent teasing messages. Even his mother called, half amused, half worried. "Ethan," she said on the phone, "please tell me this isn't another scandal." "It's not a scandal. Mom, she's just a friend." "Well, keep it that way," she warned. "People are watching you." When he hung up, he felt a wave of frustration. All he had done was talk to someone genuine, and the world turned it into a story. That evening, he went to the park as usual, but Lena wasn't there. Her spot under the lamp was empty. The wooden stool, the violin case, gone. He waited for almost an hour, watching as people passed by, but she didn't come. The next day, she still wasn't there. By the third day, he couldn't take it anymore. He walked to her neighborhood, the small street she had mentioned once. He found the building easily, an old narrow one with peeling paint and a small balcony on the top floor. He knocked on her door. After a moment, Lena opened it. Her eyes looked tired but calm. "I figured you'd come," she said quietly. "Why did you disappear?" he asked. "You just stopped showing up," she sighed. "I didn't want to cause you trouble. I saw the news. People are talking about us like it's a show." "I don't care what they say," he said firmly. "You might not," she said. "But I do. My father saw those articles too. He doesn't like seeing my name mixed with rumors." Ethan looked down, feeling a pang of guilt. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen." "I know," she said softly. "But sometimes good intentions bring noise, and I don't want that noise around my family." He stood there quietly for a few seconds. Then he said, "You don't have to hide. You've done nothing wrong." "I'm not hiding," she said gently. "I'm just stepping back." He wanted to argue, but something in her tone stopped him. Instead, he asked, "Can I come in?" She hesitated, then nodded. Inside, the small apartment looked even smaller than he remembered. The walls were lined with books and old music sheets. Her father was sitting in a chair by the window, a blanket over his knees. "Ah," the old man said when he saw Ethan. "The famous billionaire in the news." Ethan felt his face warm. "I'm sorry for all that. I didn't mean to drag your daughter into anything." The old man chuckled softly. "You didn't drag her anywhere. The world just loves to talk when it's bored." Lena brought out 2 cups of tea and placed one in front of Ethan. "I'll be fine," she said quietly. "This will pass." Ethan nodded but didn't look convinced. "If you ever need help with anything," she cut him off gently. "I told you before I don't want help. I just want peace." He looked at her for a moment, trying to understand how she could stay so calm while he felt so restless. "You really mean that, don't you?" "I do," she said. "Peace is worth more than money." He smiled faintly. "You keep teaching me things I should already know." She smiled back, but her eyes looked distant, almost sad. That night, when Ethan returned to his apartment, he couldn't sleep again. He sat by the window, staring at the city lights. The streets below were full of noise and movement, but he couldn't stop thinking about that quiet apartment, the sound of her father's soft cough, and the way Lena's voice carried calmness even in chaos. Days passed, then weeks. He didn't see her at the park anymore, but the music stayed in his mind. Sometimes he'd walk past the spot, just to remember what it sounded like when she played. The world felt emptier without that sound. Then one morning, as he sat in his office, his assistant walked in again. "Sir, there's a charity event tonight. It's for funding music education programs. They want you to attend." Ethan wasn't interested at first, but then the assistant added, "Apparently there's going to be a special live performance by a local musician. Her name is Lena." Ethan looked up immediately. "Lena?" "Yes, sir. I believe that's her." That evening, the event was held in a large hall filled with polished floors and glittering chandeliers. Wealthy guests mingled, sipping champagne and talking in polite tones. Ethan stood near the back, feeling strangely nervous. When the lights dimmed and the announcer spoke, the room went quiet. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome a young musician who reminds us that music can still touch hearts beyond walls of fame and fortune." Then she stepped onto the stage. Lena looked different. Tonight, not because of fancy clothes or makeup, but because of her presence. She held her violin with confidence, her posture straight, her eyes calm. She didn't look like a street performer anymore. She looked like she belonged there. When she started to play, the sound filled the hall like a breeze through glass. Every note shimmered, soft but powerful. The room of business people and billionaires stood completely silent, caught by something they couldn't explain. Ethan watched her, unable to look away. He'd heard her play before, but this was different. It was as if she'd poured every part of her heart into the music. Pain, joy, and all the quiet strength she carried. When she finished, the hall erupted in applause. People stood up clapping, cheering. Lena bowed gracefully, her expression calm but proud. Ethan felt something warm build in his chest. Pride, admiration, maybe even love. But he stayed where he was, waiting for the right moment. After the performance, people surrounded her. Reporters, sponsors, event organizers. Ethan waited patiently at a distance until the crowd began to thin. Then quietly he approached her. "You were incredible," he said softly. She turned, smiling when she saw him. "You came, of course," he said. "I couldn't miss that. Thank you," she said. "It means a lot." They stood there for a moment, surrounded by the fading sound of music and chatter. "I'm happy for you," he said sincerely. "You deserve to be heard." "I didn't do it for fame," she replied. "I did it for my father. He's always wanted to hear me play on a real stage." Ethan nodded. "How's he doing?" She looked down for a second. "He's getting weaker, but he smiled today for the first time in weeks." He reached out slightly as if to comfort her, then stopped himself. "He's proud of you." "Anyone would be." She looked up at him. "You sound different lately, softer." He smiled. "Maybe your music did that to me." She laughed lightly. "Music doesn't change people. People choose to listen differently." He thought about that for a long time. A few days later, Lena visited his office for the first time. She had come to drop off an invitation, a small community concert she was planning, free for anyone who wanted to attend. "I want to make it something special," she said. "For kids who can't afford lessons. Maybe you could help with that?" Ethan smiled. "Now you're asking me for help?" She grinned. "Only because it's not for me." He agreed without hesitation. Together, they started planning the small concert. Ethan used his resources to find a venue, and Lena gathered young musicians from around the city. They spent late evenings discussing details, laughing over small mistakes and sharing food after long days. Slowly, their connection deepened, not rushed, not dramatic, just real. But just as everything started feeling right, fate had another turn waiting. 2 days before the concert, Ethan received a call. It was Lena's neighbor. Her father had been taken to the hospital. Ethan rushed there immediately. Lena was sitting by her father's bedside, her eyes red but her hands calm. When she saw him, she gave a small smile. "He wanted to see the concert," she said quietly. "He kept saying he'd sit in the front row." Ethan sat beside her. "He will. We'll make sure of it." The old man looked at them weakly, but his eyes still had warmth. "I told you," he whispered. "Music brings people together, even those who didn't know they were lost." Ethan swallowed hard. "You were right," the old man smiled faintly. "Promise me you'll keep playing, both of you, in your own ways." Lena nodded, tears filling her eyes. "I promise." That night, Ethan stayed with her at the hospital. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. Sometimes silence said more. When morning came, the sun shone through the window, lighting up the room. Lena's father was sleeping peacefully, a faint smile on his face. For the first time, Ethan reached out and took Lena's hand. She didn't pull away. She just leaned her head on his shoulder, and for a moment, the world felt still. Neither of them knew what would come next, but both knew something had already changed forever. The morning of the concert arrived with a soft glow in the sky. The air felt gentle, the kind that carried both excitement and nervousness. For Lena, it was the biggest day of her life. She had been planning this concert for weeks, gathering children, rehearsing, printing small flyers with borrowed money, and convincing the community center to lend her their hall for one evening. But her heart wasn't at peace. Her father was still in the hospital. His condition hadn't worsened, but he was weak, barely able to speak for long. The doctor said it was best for him to rest, but Lena knew he wanted to be there. She sat by his bed early that morning, holding his hand. "I'll play for you tonight," she whispered. "Even if you can't be there, I'll make sure you can hear it somehow." Her father smiled faintly. "You already have, my dear. Every time you play, I hear it in here," he said, pressing his chest lightly. Tears filled her eyes, but she blinked them away and smiled. "Then I'll play my best tonight." Across town, Ethan was standing in the middle of the concert hall, checking every detail. He had quietly arranged extra chairs, better lighting, and sound equipment. He didn't tell Lena, not wanting her to feel like he was taking over, but he wanted everything to be perfect. The hall wasn't huge, but it was beautiful. White walls, soft golden lights, and a small wooden stage in front. Children were running around with violins, flutes, and small drums, their laughter filling the space. Some parents helped set up chairs while volunteers pinned posters that said "The Promise Concert, a Night of Hope." When Lena arrived that afternoon, she froze at the door. She had expected a small crowd, maybe a few rows of people. But the room looked full already, and people were still walking in. Ethan walked up to her with a warm smile. "Surprise," he said. "Looks like word got around." Her eyes widened. "Did you do all this?" He shook his head. "Not all of it. Just helped a little. The rest is you. People came because of what you've built." She looked around, overwhelmed. "I don't know what to say." "Say you're ready," he said gently. She smiled softly. "I'm ready." As evening fell, the hall filled completely. The buzz of conversation slowly quieted when the lights dimmed. Lena walked to the stage, her simple white dress glowing softly under the spotlight. She looked out at the crowd, faces of strangers, children, families, people who probably hadn't been in the same room before tonight. She took a deep breath. "Thank you for being here," she began. "This concert isn't just about music. It's about hope, and about remembering that even when life gets hard, we can still create something beautiful." She paused, her voice steady but gentle. "Every song tonight is for someone who believes that kindness and courage still matter. And this first one is for my father." The room went silent. Then she lifted her violin, and the first note filled the air. The melody was soft and tender, the kind that wrapped around people's hearts. It wasn't just sound, it was feeling. Her fingers moved carefully, her eyes closed, and every part of her body spoke through the music. Ethan stood at the back of the hall, watching her, completely still. He had seen her play before, but never like this. She looked radiant, as if the light itself followed her bow. And for the first time, he realized that her gift wasn't just talent. It was her way of healing the world around her. When the song ended, the hall erupted in applause. Some people even stood up, cheering. Lena smiled shyly and nodded, then motioned for the children to join her. One by one, they came to the stage with their instruments, a small orchestra of hope. They played cheerful songs, pieces that made the audience clap along. Some children missed a few notes, others played too loud, but no one cared. The room was full of laughter and warmth. During a short break, Lena went backstage and found Ethan waiting there. "You're doing great," he said, his eyes full of pride. She smiled. "The kids are amazing, aren't they?" "They are," he said, "but you're the reason they believe in themselves." She looked down, shyly tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "I just gave them a chance. They did the rest." Before she could say more, her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen and froze. It was the hospital. Her heart raced as she stepped aside and answered. "Hello? Yes, this is Lena." "What happened?" Ethan watched her face pale as she listened. She didn't say much, just nodded slowly. When she ended the call, her hands were trembling. "What is it?" he asked quickly. "It's my father," she whispered. He's not doing well. They said I should come right away." Ethan didn't hesitate. "I'll drive you." She looked toward the stage where the children were waiting for her to start the next piece. The audience was still chatting, unaware of what was happening. "I can't leave now. They're waiting for me." He shook his head. "They'll understand. You have to go." Tears welled up in her eyes. "He wanted to hear me play tonight." "He said he'd be listening." Ethan placed a hand on her shoulder. "Then let's make sure he does." He grabbed his phone and called his driver. Within minutes, they were on their way to the hospital, the sound of the audience fading behind them. When they arrived, the nurse led them to her father's room. The machines beeped softly, and the old man looked weaker than ever, but his eyes lit up when he saw them. "Did you play?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Lena nodded, kneeling beside him. "I did, but I came to see you before I finished." He smiled faintly. "You should finish it, my dear. Don't stop halfway. Life's music deserves an ending." Tears slipped down her cheeks. "I can't leave you now." The old man's hand trembled as he reached for hers. "Then play here," he whispered. Ethan looked around the room and saw a small chair in the corner. He quickly brought it closer to the bed. Lena hesitated, then took out her violin. The hospital room was small, but when she began to play, it felt infinite. The sound filled every corner, soft and pure. Nurses walking by stopped to listen. The music was gentle, like a heartbeat, rising and falling with emotion. Her father closed his eyes, smiling peacefully. "That's my girl," he whispered. When she finished, silence filled the room. Calm, deep silence. Ethan placed a hand on her shoulder, his expression tender. "He heard you," he said quietly. She looked at her father and nodded, unable to speak. For a moment, the only sound was the faint hum of the machines and the rhythm of their breathing. Later that night, as they sat in the waiting area, Lena leaned against Ethan's shoulder. "He's been my strength all my life," she said softly. "I don't know how to be strong without him." Ethan looked down at her. "Maybe now it's your turn to be the strength. For others. For yourself." She didn't reply, but she held his hand tightly. The next morning, when she returned to the concert hall, the sun was already high. The children were still there, waiting for her. Someone had told them what happened, and when they saw her walk in, they all ran up and hugged her. One of the little girls looked up at her and said, "We played your song last night, Miss Lena." Everyone clapped. Lena smiled through her tears. "Thank you," she whispered. The community center manager handed her a small flash drive. "Someone recorded it for you. You can show it to your father." Her eyes filled again, and she nodded gratefully. "Thank you so much." Ethan appeared beside her. "I already checked." "The video looks beautiful." Lena turned to him, her voice trembling. "You stayed after I left?" He nodded. "I finished what you started. Someone had to make sure your music reached everyone, including him." That night, Lena returned to the hospital and showed her father the video. Though he was weak, his eyes stayed on the screen the whole time. When it ended, he turned to her and said softly, "Now I can rest. You made your promise." She held his hand tightly, tears falling silently. "I'll keep playing always," she whispered. A few days later, her father passed peacefully in his sleep. It was quiet, gentle, just like his life had been. Ethan was there, standing quietly at the funeral. He didn't speak much, but his presence said enough. When it was over, Lena walked to him, her face pale but composed. "He'd want me to keep playing," she said softly. Ethan nodded. "Then you should. And I'll help however I can. Not because I feel sorry for you, but because I believe in what you're doing." Lena looked at him, tears still in her eyes, but there was a small, grateful smile on her lips. "You've already helped more than you know." As they walked away from the small chapel together, the sun broke through the clouds, lighting the path ahead. For a moment, neither spoke. There was sadness, yes, but also peace. And somewhere deep inside, both of them knew this wasn't the end of their story. It was the beginning of something new, something built not on promises of money or power, but on understanding, kindness, and a shared belief that even after loss, life could still be beautiful. Weeks passed after the funeral, and life slowly started to settle again. The house felt quieter than ever, but Lena kept herself busy. Every morning she visited the children's music center, teaching them to play, helping them laugh, reminding them that music could still bring light into dark places. She smiled often, but those close to her could still see the sadness behind her eyes. It wasn't the kind that showed in tears anymore. It was the quiet kind, the one that lingered in silence. Ethan, meanwhile, had changed more than anyone expected. The man who once cared about nothing but profit and prestige was now spending time in community halls, meeting with organizers and finding ways to support small programs like Lena's. He didn't do it for recognition. In fact, he rarely mentioned it to anyone. For the first time, his work felt meaningful. One afternoon, he drove to the center carrying a box of new instruments. The children cheered when they saw him. They called him Mr. Helper, a nickname that made him laugh every time. Lena came out from one of the classrooms wiping her hands on a cloth. When she saw him, her smile softened. "You shouldn't keep bringing things, Ethan. You've already done enough." He shrugged lightly. "Maybe I just like seeing them happy. Besides, it's not charity. It's a partnership." She raised an eyebrow. "A partnership?" He nodded. "Yes, you handle the music. I'll handle the rest." She smiled faintly. "You're getting good at this, you know." "The whole human connection thing," he chuckled. "Well, I had a good teacher." They both laughed softly, the kind of laugh that came easily between two people who had learned to trust each other. Over the next few months, they worked together closely. Ethan helped raise funds for the center, brought in sponsors for concerts, and even convinced one of his company's branches to start a music outreach program. But what touched him the most wasn't the success, it was the small things. Watching Lena kneel beside a shy child, gently showing them how to hold a violin, seeing her eyes light up when a student finally played a tune correctly, hearing the children call her Miss Hope because she never gave up on anyone. Every day with her made him feel something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. One evening, after the children left, they sat outside the center on the steps. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. "It's strange," Lena said softly, staring at the horizon. "When I lost my father, I thought I'd never find the strength to keep going. But somehow, being here with them, it feels like he's still around." Ethan nodded. "He'd be proud of you. You've built something beautiful." She looked at him quietly. "And what about you? You've changed so much. The man I met at that event months ago wouldn't have cared about any of this." He smiled faintly. Maybe he needed someone to remind him what really matters. She tilted her head. "And what's that?" He looked at her for a long moment before answering. "People. Not power, not wealth, just people." Her eyes softened, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The wind rustled the leaves nearby, and the faint sound of laughter from the park carried through the air. Then Ethan said something unexpected. "You know, I still remember that night I shouted, 'I'll marry you if you play.'" Lena laughed gently. "You really made a scene that night." He smiled, shaking his head. "I was a fool. I didn't even know who I was insulting. I thought money gave me the right to joke like that." She looked at him, her expression calm but kind. "You've apologized enough. What matters is what you've done since then." He turned toward her. "Still, I meant what I said that night, but not the way I said it. Back then it was pride talking. Now," he paused, taking a breath, "now I mean it with my heart. I'd marry you not because of what you can do, but because of who you are." For a moment she didn't answer. The world around them felt still. No sound, no movement, just the fading sunlight and the space between their words. Then she smiled softly. "You don't need to say that, Ethan. I'm not saying it because I need to," he said quietly. "I'm saying it because I finally understand what love really means. It's not a deal. It's not a promise you shout in public. It's something you build, one small act at a time." Lena looked down at her hands, then back at him. "I'm not ready for that yet," she said gently. "My heart is still healing, and right now my music, it's my way of staying close to the people I've lost." He nodded, not disappointed, but understanding. "Then I'll wait. Not because I expect anything, but because being near you makes me a better person." She smiled, her eyes glistening. "That's the kindest thing anyone's ever said to me." They sat together quietly after that, the sky fading into deep blue. The streetlights flickered on, and somewhere in the distance a child's laughter echoed. It felt like a promise, not of romance, but of hope. Months later, Lena organized another concert, this time on a larger stage. The children were older now, more confident. The event was bigger than before, and journalists, sponsors, even city officials attended. Ethan watched proudly from the front row as Lena introduced the performance. "This concert," she said, "is not just about music. It's about growth. It's about believing that kindness and hard work can change lives. Every note played tonight carries a story, of a child who refused to give up, of a community that came together, and of the belief that love, in all its forms, can heal." As she began to play, the audience fell silent. The sound filled the auditorium, warm, strong, alive. Ethan felt something in his chest stir, the same feeling he had when he first heard her play in that small room months ago. When the last note faded, the applause was thunderous. People stood cheering, clapping, calling her name. Tears glistened on her face as she bowed, her smile wide and bright. After the show, Ethan found her backstage. She looked exhausted but happy. "You were incredible," he said. She laughed softly. "The kids did all the work." He shook his head. "No, you gave them the courage. You gave me courage too." She looked up at him, touched. "You really mean that?" "More than anything," he said quietly. "You showed me that the greatest success isn't what we build, it's who we become." For a long moment, they just looked at each other, surrounded by the sound of laughter, music, and celebration. That night, as Lena left the hall, she looked up at the sky. The stars were bright, scattered like tiny notes on a dark sheet of music. She thought of her father and smiled. "See, Papa," she whispered. "We did it." Behind her, Ethan walked up slowly. "Talking to him again?" he asked gently. She nodded. "Always," he smiled. "I think he's proud." "I know I am." They walked side by side down the quiet street. The world felt peaceful, as if all the noise had softened into harmony. As they reached the crossroads, Lena turned to him. "You know, that night you said you'd marry me if I played. I thought you were mocking me." "I was," he admitted softly. "But now I'd say it differently." She smiled. "How would you say it now?" He looked at her, eyes calm but full of warmth. "I'd say I'll walk beside you if you'll let me. I don't need promises, just a chance to share the music." Her eyes glistened. "That's a better line," he laughed quietly. "Took me a while to learn." They stood there for a while, neither rushing, neither pushing. Just two people who had found meaning in each other's journey. As they walked away together, the sound of the city returned. Faint horns, footsteps, distant chatter. But beneath it all there was a melody. Not one played on a violin, but one that lived between them. Soft, steady, and real. It wasn't the end of their story. It was the beginning of a new one. A story not written by pride or power, but by kindness, forgiveness, and love that had learned to speak quietly. The world would remember the billionaire who once shouted a careless promise. Not for his wealth, but for how he changed. And it would remember the girl with the violin. The one who turned insult into inspiration, pain into purpose, and music into hope, and somewhere. If you listened closely, you could almost hear her father's voice, proud and gentle, whispering through the music. She kept her promise.